On a cold night in February 1973, a caravan rolled through the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The cars were packed with 200 Indians, men and women, local Oglala Lakota, and members of the urban militant group, the American Indian Movement. They headed toward the hallowed ground of Wounded Knee, the site of the last massacre of the Indian Wars.
Going into Wounded Knee that night, when it was dark and scary, and we were clinging to our weapons tightly. It was a full moon, and we knew that a battle was going to come. I was sitting there thinking of some of these young men that are around me. Am I committing them to die?
I was ready to do whatever it takes for change. I didn't care. I had children, and for them, I figured I could make a stand here.
They were up to no good. I mean, why would they be traveling in a caravan with all these weapons and all these Molotov cocktails if they weren't going to engage in some kind of destructive activity?
By the 1970s, Native people, once masters of the continent, had become invisible, consigned to the margins of American life. Their anger and frustration would explode in Wounded Knee.
We were about to be obliterated culturally. Our spiritual way of life, our entire way of life was about to be stamped out. And this was a rebirth of our dignity and self-pride.
For the next 71 days, Indian protesters at Wounded Knee would hold off the federal government at gunpoint. Media from around the world would give the siege day-by-day coverage, and Native Americans from across the nation would come to Wounded Knee to be part of what they hoped would be a new beginning.
The message that went out is that a band of Indians could take on this government. Tecumseh had his day, and Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and we had ours.
We have tonight one of the strangest stories to come along in a long time. A group of American Indians has taken over the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and they have been holding it for nearly a whole day. This afternoon, the FBI said the Indians are in charge of the town.
We had just finished eating our dinner, and so I looked out the window and I said, well, for heaven's sake, who opened the store? And they're carrying things out, bringing things out by the carload. And I was floored, just floored.
After stripping bare the Wounded Knee trading post, the village's only store, the protesters took over a local church, holding the minister and other white residents hostage. They quickly blocked all roads leading into town.
On Tuesday, February 27th, I received a telephone call from some news outlet. I was told that the caravan forcibly took over the village, were holding hostages and causing destruction there. So I immediately got my agents together and I proceeded to the main entrance to Wounded Knee.
We saw a Fed car coming, and then it kind of came, drove just right up, kind of not too far off. So when they come on, they got out of the car, they went looking around, and as soon as they put the glasses up, we opened up on them. Let them know we are here, and that's far enough.
I called inside Wounded Knee, and I said, look, let's get together and have a meeting so we can stop the potential for bloodshed here. Let's talk about this. As I walked up to them, I see all these rifles pointed at me, and it gives you an uneasy feeling.
Yes, sir. Joseph Trimbach with the FBI.
Trimbach came to that roadblock, and you could tell he'd been up all night, and he's very irritable.
And we have law enforcement back here that's armed, and we have hostages here.
I have no idea what's going to happen next. They came out and gave me this list of demands.
The protesters called for a federal investigation of corruption on reservations in South Dakota and immediate Senate hearings on broken treaties with Indian nations.
The headquarters of the Sioux people.
We're angry about losing our land, losing our language, being ripped off of our ability to live as Indian people. Our parents was telling us, you have to walk the white man road. Indian ways are going to be gone. Be a Christian. You know, go to school and learn that English, but don't learn your own language. We wanted to give our lives in such a way that would bring attention to what was happening in Indian country, and we were pretty sure that we were going to have to give our lives.
Since its founding in 1968, the American Indian movement had been divisive, its militant tactics controversial even among Native people. Created in Minneapolis by young urban Indians fed up with police harassment, the group had shown a knack for generating publicity. Members had seized high-profile symbols, Plymouth Rock, the Mayflower, Mount Rushmore, and in November 1972 had occupied and vandalized the Washington headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Weeks later, in early 1973, AIM took its campaign into the reservation border towns of South Dakota.
In those days, there was a tremendous amount of racism, especially in the border towns around the reservations. I mean, real racism, where Indians are practically invisible.
There was towns you didn't drive through, didn't go through, especially women. You didn't walk down the street of any border town by yourself because you'd be accosted by any white man that felt like it.
Just weeks before the occupation of Wounded Knee, a white man killed an Indian near Custer, South Dakota, 50 miles from Pine Ridge. When local officials charged him with manslaughter, not murder, 200 angry AIM protesters came to town.
And you charge a white man premeditated murder, you charge him with second-degree manslaughter, and we ain't going for it anymore. And I know this whole damn town is an armed camp.
Hey, listen, white man, I have had all the bullshit from your race as I can take.
When police barred them from entering the courthouse, AIM members forced their way in.
Open the doors up. Go in, go in.
Just as we walked in through the door, then we were attacked by law enforcement. We were fighting, and they come at me with the nightstick, so I blocked it and took it away and started using it on them.
I know I was right on the steps, you know, and things were happening. We bloodied the guy, we took the helmet away, we bloodied him up. Then I ran across to help get gas from the filling station. We're filling up, making Molotov cocktails and busting the bottles on the building, and the fire just started on the wall and everything.
Protesters set the courthouse ablaze and left Custer in shambles.
There was absolutely an element in AIM that considered itself a revolutionary organization who were comfortable being around guns, who absolutely loved the idea of AIM being outlaws, who just wanted to get it on.
AIM can bring bodies, they can bring people. They have phone numbers of people at TV networks who can get on airplanes and bring television cameras out. None of the established national Indian organizations can do what AIM does.
The American Indian Movement's motto was anytime, anywhere, any place. And that was the most important job that we could do, is to be where there was injustice and to confront it.
In the 19th century, the Lakota fought furiously to defend their territory against relentless American expansion. In 1868, embattled Lakota chiefs signed the Fort Laramie Treaty to protect more than 30 million acres of their land. But the United States soon reneged and forced the Lakota onto small, desolate reservations.
Americans like to think that American Indian history is something in the past. I'm one generation removed from the genocide of my tribe. And every tribe in this country has a time of horror. I mean a time of absolute horror when they were confronted by this invader. And some have happened almost 500 years ago. But as they come across the plains, our time of horror came in the late 1800s, and we remember it very well.
In the frigid winter of 1890, Chief Bigfoot was leading a group of Lakota, mainly women and children, to shelter on the Pine Ridge Reservation. On the morning of December 29th, they were attacked by the U.S. Army on the banks of Wounded Knee Creek.
My great-grandmother is Katie Warbonnet. She was a survivor at Wounded Knee. When the shooting broke out, she and her sister got Keeksawi, ran down into the ravine and made it to some plum bushes. And she could hear the firing and hollering, and then finally it was quiet.
More than 300 Lakota people lay dead. After remaining untouched in the ice and snow for 3 days, they were buried in a mass grave. The massacre would mark the brutal end of centuries of armed Indian resistance. For those who came nearly 100 years later, Wounded Knee was sacred land.
I walked over to a gully and I picked up some sage and I went to wash myself and I prayed to those ancestors that were there in that gully. And I said, we're back. We'll return my relations. We belong.
By the late 19th century, the Indian Wars were over. The United States seized on a ruthless strategy to assimilate Native children to a subordinate place in white-dominated society. Government-run boarding schools.
I was 5 years old. My mother was crying and they were taking us off, and my sister Audrey, who also, was like a second mother to me and a very close friend as a sister. And my brother Mark, they were very sad. Within 2 hours or so after the buses filled up and we're down the road, this is the furthest I've ever been from my home in my life. And then of course it turns into evening and we arrive at this place.
I ended up in a place where nothing made any sense at all. It wasn't home, it wasn't, I didn't know anything about school. Nobody ever told me anything about school. I didn't know what the education was. I remember that I wanted to go home, period. I didn't want to be there, I just wanted to go home.
And we all had to strip down naked, and then they put the DDT on us, they line us up, they're cutting our hair. You have long hair, you have braids, and that gets cut off. And I would say within a matter of an hour and a half, we're standing there, all looking alike.
Between the 1870s and the 1960s, Over 100,000 Indian children were sent to one of the nearly 500 boarding schools scattered across the United States.
Through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
We couldn't sing any native songs or tribal songs. They just started using English. You could not use any other language. And we'd whisper it. Pass the Bequasigan, pass the bread over. It's like I had to be two people. I had to be Now Cummig, I had to be Dennis Banks. Now Cummig is my real name, my Ojibwe name. Dennis Banks had to be very protective of Now Cummig. And so I learned who the presidents were, and I learned the math, I learned the social studies, I learned the English, and Now Cummig was still there.
This is education that was promised us, that was guaranteed us through the treaties. But it wasn't. It's torture, brainwashing. They called us many different names. Savage, dumb. And we got beat for looking like an Indian, smelling like an Indian, even speaking Indian. Everything I did.
Their de-Indianization program, it failed. But the toll was devastating. It destroyed our family. It destroyed that relationship we had with our mother. I could never regain that friendship, loveship relationship that I had with my mother. It wasn't there anymore. And that's what, to this day, I keep thinking that, you know, damn this government, what it did to me and what it did to thousands of other children across this country.
Many of the protesters had left reservations behind, along with thousands of other Indians, as part of the federal government's Indian relocation program of the 1950s and 60s.
The government thought one way to solve the Indian problem was to relocate Indians from the reservation to the bigger cities. They couldn't kill the Indians anymore. That was out of fashion by the 50s. So they decided to experiment. They did a lot of experimenting with Indians. Relocation program was one such experiment.
It was exciting, relocation. You know, you get to go to a big city and they'll help you find a job, and you'll get to, you know, see the rest of the country. Of course, you weren't forced to go on relocation, but they made it look good. Streets paved with gold. We ended up in Cleveland, Ohio.
Over 100,000 Indians were relocated in just 15 years. The government promised to help them find schools, housing, and employment. But for many, the promise rang hollow.
They put us in a real dumpy motel, and I was just sitting there thinking, I wonder what's going on at home. I could just see the rolling hills and the small town. They're all just moving and walking and going real fast, and nobody's stopping to look around. That's why we stayed in our apartments or stayed in our rooms.
If you went and applied for a job,
You better not tell them you're Indian. You better tell them you're French or you're some Italian or some other nationality. You wouldn't get the job.
By the 1970s, half of all Indians lived in cities. But the relocation program produced an unanticipated result.
It pulled us all closer together. We could always spot each other in the city. So if we'd see an Indian on the street, walking down Market Street, we'd look at each other and we'd just smile and kind of shake our head, or, you know, an acknowledgement of each other. We didn't care what tribe anyone was. We were Indian people. We were a race.
The new pan-Indian identity led to the growth of activist groups around the country. The American Indian movement was the most radical.
There were a lot of Native people that were afraid to stand up. Geronimo demonstrated, man. Crazy Horse demonstrated. And for us, the baby boom generation, circumstances were right. We could raise our voice.
Despite the chaos that followed in its wake, Wounded Knee would prove to be a turning point in the history of Native people.
We need to let the rest of the world know what was going on. 2 states over, they had no idea about Indian people. We were just invisible. We were the ones that kicked the doors open on the Indian issue and let the world see.
The good that came out of Wounded Knee was the entry into American Indian political life of people who had not been there before, who had not had a real voice. People learned they could tackle problems, create opportunities, and I think that coming out of Wounded Knee, people knew they could make a difference.
There was a lot of sense of we're important and we can do something within our own people, our own tribe, our own homes. I didn't go back to what I was doing before. I felt maybe I can do something to help not only my people, but other people too.
Native activism would spur the revitalization of Native cultures. In the years following the siege at Wounded Knee, Indians would create tribal schools and cultural institutions charged with preserving Indian traditions and passing them on.
In the late 60s and early 70s, these were still emerging ideas about reconnecting with traditional culture, language, religion. That was starting to happen. But this became the majority sentiment in the space of just a handful of years. It was really about identity. It was about affirming we're still here, we want to be here, and we want to be here on our own terms.
Whatever went on in the 60s and 70s, it's an extension, it's a continuation. It's no different than what King Philip was about, or Crazy Horse was about. And whatever means and manner we could, since the Europeans arrived here, we've had to fight for our survival.
What the 1973 occupation did was people started saying, hey, we're Indians. It's okay to be Indian. We are Indian. We really should be who we are. The struggle that we have in the 21st century is to remain ourselves. Every one of us has to do our part to remain Lakota, to remain Indian, and to teach our children, to teach our grandchildren, and make sure that there will be children sitting in Sweat Lodge, standing at the Sundance in 1,000 years.